An accidental discovery of a personal diary reveals hidden facets of his maid's life. The millionaire is confronted with startling truths that not only change his view of her, but also force him to reflect on his own life choices. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. David Carter stood in his marble-floored foyer, checking his Patek Philippe watch while event planners bustled around him, preparing for that evening's charity gala. The cause was something predictably safe: arts education for privileged youth. At 45, David had mastered the art of philanthropic gestures that enhanced his social standing without disrupting the status quo. "Mr. Carter, where would you like the ice sculptures?" called out the event coordinator, her clipboard clutched tightly against her designer blazer. "Put them by the east windows," he answered, barely looking up from his phone. The late afternoon California sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the imported Italian tiles. His mansion, a 15,000-square-foot Mediterranean-style estate in Pacific Palisades, had hosted dozens of such events, each more lavish than the last. David made his way to his home office, intending to review some documents before guests arrived. The room, with its mahogany shelves and leather-bound books, projected exactly the image he wanted: success, sophistication, and carefully curated intelligence. As he reached for a folder on the top shelf, his elbow caught the edge of a heavy bronze bookend. The domino effect was instantaneous. The bookend toppled, taking with it a cascade of books and decorative objects. Among the scattered items, something caught his eye: a worn notebook he'd never seen before. The cover was simple, black leatherette with worn corners, nothing like the expensive stationery he used. Picking it up, he noticed it had slipped out from behind the shelving unit, where it must have been hidden for some time. The name Michelle Johnson was written in neat handwriting on the first page. Michelle, his housekeeper for the past 5 years. She was efficient, professional, and largely invisible in his daily life, like most of his household staff. He'd never thought much about her beyond her role in maintaining his comfortable lifestyle. Against his better judgment, David opened the diary. The first entry was dated 15 years ago. "Today marks another rejection. 4th job this month where they went with someone else. Strange how they all decide that right after meeting me in person. Mama says I should expect it, that nothing comes easy for people like us. But I've got 2 degrees and more determination than any of them know. Tomorrow I'll try again." David's brow furrowed as he continued reading. The next entries detail Michelle's childhood in South Central Los Angeles. Her mother working 3 jobs to keep them afloat, the casual cruelty she encountered in predominantly white schools where she'd earned scholarships, and the constant pressure to be twice as good to get half as far. The words painted a picture of a life that existed parallel to his own, yet in a completely different reality. He read about her struggles to secure student loans for college, the skeptical academic advisors who suggested she choose an easier major, and the countless small indignities she faced daily. A particular entry caught his attention. "Sometimes I wonder if they see us at all. Today, I watched Mrs. Henderson plan another charity gala, something about urban youth. They'll raise thousands of dollars, pat themselves on the back, and never once speak to any of the people they claim to help. We're here in their homes, cleaning their spaces, raising their children, but we might as well be ghosts." David shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, aware of the event preparations continuing downstairs. The diary in his hands suddenly felt heavier. Here was a woman who had worked in his home for years, maintaining his lifestyle, while carrying a world of experiences he'd never bothered to consider. The sound of caterers arriving snapped him back to the present. He should close the diary, return it, and forget about it. Instead, he found himself turning to the next page, drawn into Michelle's narrative despite himself. Each entry revealed more layers of a life defined by resilience in the face of systematic obstacles. Obstacles that his own privilege had rendered invisible to him until now. The contrast between the world described in these pages and the one he inhabited struck him with unexpected force. As the sun continued its descent outside his window, David Carter, master of his domain, sat surrounded by the trappings of his success, suddenly feeling like a stranger in his own home. The charity gala could wait. David settled deeper into his chair, the diary commanding his full attention now. The next entry shook him more than he expected, each page revealing incidents that made his stomach tighten with discomfort. Michelle wrote about a job interview at a prestigious private school. They loved my resume over the phone. The principal even called me impressively qualified. Then I walked into the interview room. You could see it in their eyes, that split-second shift. The principal's smile became fixed, artificial. They asked if I'd be more comfortable applying to schools in other districts. I knew what that meant. 7 years of teaching experience, a master's in education, and perfect recommendations, all erased by the color of my skin. David ran his hand through his silver-streaked hair, remembering his own board meetings. How many times had he witnessed that same subtle shift in expression, the careful rearrangement of words? How many times had he said nothing? The diary continued, describing an incident at a high-end department store where Michelle had gone to buy a gift for her mother. Security followed me through every aisle today. Not even subtly, just 3 steps behind, watching every move. The same guard ignored the white woman who was literally stuffing makeup into her purse 2 aisles over. When I finally reached the counter, the saleswoman asked to see additional ID with my credit card. Store policy, she said. Funny how she hadn't asked for the same from the previous 3 customers. His phone buzzed, messages about the gala's final arrangements. David silenced it. The contrast between preparing for another self-congratulatory charity event and reading these raw accounts of daily injustice felt obscene. But it was the next section of the diary that truly caught him off guard. Michelle wrote about her volunteer work. Another full Saturday at the community center. We're up to 30 kids now in the weekend program. They're brilliant. All of them. Destiny wants to be a marine biologist. Marcus can solve complex math problems in his head. Little Tamara writes poetry that makes me cry. But their school is falling apart. No computers, no science lab, textbooks held together with tape. Their potential is being buried under systemic neglect. Page after page detailed her efforts. Staying late to tutor kids who couldn't afford professional help, creating learning materials from scratch, organizing book drives, and fighting to get resources for students who'd been written off by the system. Today, one of my kids asked why the schools on the other side of town have everything while their school has nothing. How do you explain structural inequality to a 10-year-old? How do you tell them the system isn't designed for them to succeed, but they have to try anyway? David thought about his own children's private school with its state-of-the-art facilities and small class sizes. The annual tuition exceeded what many families in Michelle's community earned in a year. The guilt hit Immenwaffes. Not just abstract guilt about societal inequities, but personal specific guilt. How many times had Michelle cleaned his home office, dusting around his children's framed diplomas from elite universities? How many times had she prepared rooms for fundraising events that did more for the donor's social standing than for any actual cause? He read about her exhausting schedule, working full-time in his home, then spending evenings and weekends volunteering. No wonder she always declined overtime hours. She wasn't just being modest about extra pay. She was rushing to her real passion, teaching children who reminded her of herself at that age. A particular entry stood out. Sometimes I look at these kids and see myself. All that potential, all that drive, just needing someone to believe in them. Mr. Carter hosted another education charity event today. They raised $300,000 for arts programs at private schools. Just a fraction of that could transform our community center. But we're invisible to them. They don't see us, don't want to see us. It's easier to write checks for safe causes than to look at what's happening in their own backyard. David closed the diary, his mind racing. The woman who had worked in his home for 5 years was leading a shadow life as a community educator, fighting against the very inequalities his social circle perpetuated through their indifference. The sound of glasses clinking downstairs reminded him of the impending gala. Another evening of performative philanthropy awaited. But something had shifted. The carefully constructed walls between his world and Michelle's were crumbling, and he couldn't look away from what was being revealed. David found Michelle in the kitchen early Monday morning, efficiently organizing breakfast as she had done countless times before. But now he saw her differently, not just as his housekeeper, but as the woman whose words had kept him awake for 2 nights straight. "Michelle, do you have a moment?" His voice came out more uncertain than he'd intended. She turned, her expression professionally neutral. "Of course, Mr. Carter. I want to discuss something with you. A project." He pulled out architectural renderings he'd had rushed over the weekend. "I'm thinking of converting the old Webster building downtown into a community school." Michelle's hands stilled on the counter. "A community school?" Her tone was careful, measured. "Yes, with full facilities, science labs, computer rooms, everything. I've been doing some research about educational needs in certain communities." He couldn't bring himself to mention the diary. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter," Michelle's voice took on an edge he'd never heard before, "our community doesn't need another wealthy person's vanity project." The words hit him like a slap. "This isn't Dash. Do you know how many times we've seen this?" She continued, years of frustration breaking through her professional demeanor. "Someone wealthy feels guilty, throws money at a problem, gets their name on a building, and nothing really changes. Our children aren't props for redemption stories." David absorbed her words, understanding the anger behind them. "You're right. I don't know what I'm doing. That's why I need your help." She studied him, suspicion warring with hope in her expression. "Why now? After 5 years, why suddenly care about community education?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Let's say I've recently gained a new perspective on things." "A new perspective," she repeated flatly. "And what happens when you gain another new perspective next month?" "These are people's lives, Mr. Carter. Children's futures. It's not a hobby you can drop when it stops being interesting." "I know that," he said quietly. "I know I have a lot to learn, but I also have resources that could make a real difference if used properly. You have the knowledge, the experience, the understanding of what's actually needed. Vous arquez with me on this." Michelle's silence stretched for a long moment. Finally, she said, "I need complete control over the educational program." "Done. And it has to serve the community's actual needs, not just look good in press releases." "Absolutely." And Dash, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bradford Wellington III, one of David's oldest friends and business associates. "David, there you are." Bradford's booming voice filled the kitchen. He barely glanced at Michelle. "The boys at the club are talking about your latest project." His tone dripped with disapproval. "Have you lost your mind? Community schools? What's next, housing projects?" David felt Michelle stiffen beside him. "Bradford Dash, look, we all feel bad sometimes seeing how the other half lives. But this isn't the answer. Write a check to the United Way and be done with it. You're making everyone uncomfortable with this social justice warrior routine." David caught Michelle's expression, a mixture of resignation and bitter vindication, as if Bradford was proving every point she'd ever made about people like them. "The project is happening, Bradford," David said firmly. "With or without everyone's approval." Bradford's face reddened. "You're not thinking clearly. Is this about her?" He jerked his head toward Michelle. "Because if she's put ideas in your head, Dash, that's enough." David's voice cut through the air like steel. "Michelle is my partner in this project. If you have a problem with that, you have a problem with me." After Bradford stormed out, silence fell in the kitchen. Michelle finally spoke, her voice quiet but strong. "You'll lose friends over this. Maybe they're not the kind of friends I want anymore." She studied him for a long moment. "The science lab needs to be state-of-the-art, and we'll need a comprehensive teacher training program." David felt something tight in his chest loosen. "Tell me more." As Michelle began outlining her vision for the school, David realized he'd already crossed a line he couldn't uncross. His comfortable world of surface-level charity and easy answers was shattering. The question was, what would emerge from the pieces? The meeting room at the Pacific Palisades Country Club fell silent as David finished his presentation. He'd chosen this venue deliberately, the same place where countless business deals and charitable initiatives had been launched over expensive wines and handshakes. But today was different. Let me get this straight. Charles Whitman, CEO of 3 Fortune 500 companies, leaned forward in his leather chair. "You want to sink $20 million into a school in South Central? Have you considered the property values alone make this economically unsound?" David kept his voice steady. "The Webster Building's location is perfect precisely because it's where the need is greatest." "Need?" Victoria Sterling, who chaired 4 prestigious charity boards, laughed delicately. "David, darling, That's what public schools are for. If those people wanted better education, they'd work harder and move to better neighborhoods. From her position near the projection screen, Michelle tensed visibly. David had insisted she attend, despite her reservations. Now he understood why she'd been reluctant. Those people, David repeated slowly, are American citizens whose children deserve the same opportunities ours had. Oh, please, Bradford Wellington III interjected from the corner. Don't tell me she's gotten to you with all that social justice nonsense. He didn't even try to hide his dismissive glance at Michelle. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. David's hands clenched under the table. Michelle Johnson, he emphasized her name, has 15 years of educational experience and a master's degree in curriculum development. Her insights are invaluable to this project. David, his sister Catherine, reached across the table, her diamond bracelet catching the light. We're worried about you. First the community center donations. Now this, it's like we don't know you anymore. What would father say? The mention of his father hit hard. Jonathan Carter had built their family fortune through real estate development, often at the expense of communities like the one David now wanted to help. Father taught us to be leaders, David responded. That's what I'm doing. Leaders don't throw away their reputation on lost causes, Charles shot back. Think about your position on the hospital board, the symphony committee. People are already talking. Michelle stepped forward, her voice clear and professional. The project financials show a sustainable model that could be replicated. I don't recall asking for the help's opinion. Victoria cut in, her smile razor-sharp. David stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. That's enough. Michelle isn't the help. She's the executive director of this project, and you will treat her with respect or this meeting is over. I believe it's already over. Bradford stood, adjusting his tie. When you're ready to come to your senses, David, you know where to find us. One by one, they filed out, leaving behind half-drunk coffees and an air of disappointment. Catherine lingered at the door. Mom's devastated, you know. She had to cancel her bridge club because of the gossip. After she left, David and Michelle stood in silence, looking at the presentation slides still glowing on the screen. Architectural renderings, budget projections, curriculum plans. Well, Michelle finally said, that went about as well as expected. David loosened his tie. I knew they wouldn't understand, but I didn't expect such blatant racism. Michelle's smile was tired. Welcome to my world, Mr. Carter. David, he corrected automatically. After that disaster, I think we're well past Mr. Carter. She gathered her papers, her movements precise. They'll do more than talk, you know. They'll try to block the permits, pressure your business associates, maybe even start rumors about why you're really doing this. Let them try. He began packing up his laptop. By the way, I've already transferred the first $10 million to the project account. We start construction next month, regardless of what they think. Michelle paused. Your mother must be quite a bridge player. The best in Pacific Palisades, he smiled slightly. She'll survive the gossip. As they left the country club, David noticed several former friends turning their backs, engaging in conspicuously loud conversations about social climbers and guilty consciences. Michelle walked beside him, head high, either not hearing or choosing to ignore them. In the parking lot, she turned to him. Last chance to back out. Save your social standing, your club membership, your spot at all the right charity galas. David looked back at the building where he'd spent countless hours networking, dealing, and maintaining his position in high society. Then he looked at the woman before him, who spent her free time trying to give children a chance at a better future. What time is the contractor meeting tomorrow? The Jefferson Park Community Center hadn't seen better days in a long time. Paint peeled from the walls, fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and a persistent drip from the ceiling had created a small puddle in the corner. But none of that seemed to matter to the children gathered around worn tables, their faces intent on their workbooks. David stood in the doorway, feeling absurdly out of place in his tailored suit. Michelle moved through the room with natural ease, stopping to help one student with a math problem, praising another's essay, offering encouragement in Spanish to a recent immigrant struggling with English. This is Marcus. Michelle introduced a bright-eyed 12-year-old. He just won the district science fair with a project on sustainable energy, Marcus added proudly. I want to design solar panels that work better in cloudy weather. David knelt to examine the boys' project display. The materials were humble, cardboard, aluminum foil, items clearly salvaged from recycling bins, but the concepts were sophisticated. This is impressive work. Have you thought about where you want to study engineering? Marcus's smile dimmed slightly. My school doesn't have AP Physics. Ms. Johnson helps me study from old textbooks, but colleges want to see official advanced classes. And destiny, Michelle continued, leading David to a girl surrounded by marine biology books from the public library. She can identify every species of whale and explain their migration patterns. The ocean's getting too warm for them, Destiny explained earnestly. I want to help fix that. But, she trailed off, looking at her worn secondhand books. But what? David prompted. Our school can't afford field trips to the aquarium anymore. I've never even seen a real whale. Throughout the afternoon, David met more students. Tamara, who wrote poetry about her neighborhood but had no creative writing program at school. James, who taught himself coding using free online courses because his school's computers were too old to run modern programming software. Anna, who dreamed of becoming a doctor but whose chemistry lab consisted of watching YouTube videos of experiments. They're incredible, David murmured to Michelle as they watched the students work. All this potential, being wasted, she finished. Do you know what the dropout rate is at their high school? 60%. Not because they can't do the work, but because the system keeps telling them they don't belong in advanced classes, that their dreams are too big, that they should be more realistic about their futures. A small commotion drew their attention. Two boys were arguing over a torn textbook, the only copy for their grade level. We make do, Michelle said quietly. We photocopy pages when we can afford it. Share books. Use outdated materials because they're all we have. Meanwhile, my last employer's son had a private tutor for every subject and complained about having to read Shakespeare on an iPad instead of a Kindle. David recognized the reference to his own son's complaints from years ago. The memory made him wince. Ms. Johnson, a young girl called out, "Can you help me with this essay? I want to write about why we need more books in our library, but I don't know if I should mention that most of ours have pages missing." Michelle moved to help her, leaving David to observe the room. He noticed details he might have missed before. The way students shared single calculators between 3 or 4 people, how they used phone flashlights to read when the fluorescent lights gave out, the careful rationing of printer paper for essential assignments only. A boy working nearby looked up at him curiously. Are you really going to build us a new school? With real computers and everything? Yes, David replied, his resolve strengthening. With everything you need. Nobody ever keeps promises to us, the boy said matter-of-factly, returning to his work. The simple truth of that statement hit harder than all his former friends' accusations. These children had grown used to broken promises, to making do, to being told their dreams were unrealistic. They learned early that people like him made grand gestures that rarely materialized into real change. As he watched Michelle move from student to student, offering guidance and encouragement despite the limited resources, he understood something crucial. This wasn't about redemption or guilt or proving anything to his social circle. This was about addressing a fundamental injustice that he had benefited from while others suffered. The leaky ceiling dripped steadily in the corner. Tomorrow, he would call contractors about fixing it. It wasn't part of the school project, but he couldn't leave these kids in a building that was literally falling apart while he planned their future facility. Some promises needed to be kept immediately. The fundraising event at the Webster Building site should have been a moment of triumph. The bare bones of construction had begun, metal beams reaching toward the sky like a promise taking shape. David had arranged for local media coverage, hoping to attract additional donors who weren't part of his usual social circle. Instead, it was turning into a battlefield. "Mr. Carter," a reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "Is it true that this project is being investigated for zoning violations?" Before David could respond, another reporter jumped in. "Sources say you've lost major business contracts over this venture. Care to comment?" He maintained his composure, addressing each question with careful responses. But he could feel the momentum shifting, the narrative being twisted. Someone was orchestrating this. Then he saw him, James Whitney III, his former Harvard roommate and current city council member, working the crowd with practiced ease. James caught his eye and smiled, the kind of smile that preceded a knife in the back. "David," James called out, loud enough for nearby reporters to hear. "I must say, this is all very noble, though some of us are concerned about the impact on local property values." And the traffic studies raised some interesting questions. "Traffic studies?" Michelle whispered beside him. "We submitted those months ago. They were approved. Amazing how paperwork can get lost in the system," James replied, still smiling. "Or how previously approved permits can require additional review." David stepped forward, but Michelle's hand on his arm stopped him. She had learned long ago that certain battles couldn't be won with direct confrontation. The event continued to unravel. Potential donors kept their distance, clearly aware of the whispered controversies. Local business owners who had initially supported the project now avoided eye contact. Then Bradford Wellington III arrived, slightly drunk and ready for a scene. "David," he called out, voice carrying across the construction site. "Still playing white savior to the masses? Or is there another reason you're so invested in this project?" His gaze slid meaningfully toward Michelle. The implication hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. David's vision went red. He started forward, but Michelle moved faster. "Mr. Wellington," she said, voice clear and carrying, "would you like to tour the site? See exactly where your tax dollars won't be spent, since this is entirely privately funded? Or would you prefer to continue making insinuations that reveal far more about your character than anyone else's?" Bradford sputtered, but Michelle continued, her professional mask firmly in place. "We have architectural plans, curriculum outlines, and community impact studies available. Which would you like to discuss first?" The crowd had gone quiet, watching the confrontation. "You can't talk to me like that," Bradford hissed. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," David cut in, finding his voice. "You're someone who's about to leave this event, unless you'd like me to remind everyone about certain financial irregularities I covered up for you in '08. Bradford's face went from red to white. He turned and stalked away, but the damage was done. Later, after the crowds had dispersed and the reporters had filed their likely unfavorable stories, David and Michelle sat on the bare concrete of what would become the school's main entrance. "They'll keep coming," Michelle said quietly. "This was just the first wave." "I know." David looked at the construction site, already imagining classrooms filled with students like Marcus and Destiny. "Let them come. Your business will survive. The contracts, they're canceling? I don't want to work with people who'd use children's education as leverage anyway." Michelle was quiet for a moment. "Why are you really doing this, David?" "The truth." He thought about the diary hidden in his office, about years of blindness to the struggles happening right in front of him, about the way privilege had been a wall rather than a window. "Because it's right," he said simply. "And because it's long overdue." She nodded, accepting his answer. "We'll need to strengthen the community outreach program. Show them we're not just dropping a building here and calling it progress." "Already on it. I've been talking to local business owners about apprenticeship programs." They sat in companionable silence as the sun set behind the skeletal framework of their future school. Tomorrow would bring more battles, more accusations, more attempts to stop them. But tonight, watching shadows stretch across the foundation they were building, both literally and figuratively, David felt more certain than ever about his choice. Some walls needed to come down, no matter who tried to keep them standing. The school site office had become their unofficial headquarters, a converted shipping container filled with blueprints and curriculum plans. David and Michelle often worked late into the evening, their initial professional distance gradually giving way to something more complicated. One night, after discussing budget allocations for the science labs, Michelle went unusually quiet. "What is it?" David asked, noticing her distraction. She hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "My mother left another voicemail. Want to hear what supportive parenting sounds like?" Her tone was bitter as she pressed play. "Michelle, baby, this has gone far enough." The voice was tired, heavy with disappointment. "You're letting these white folks use you as their token again. Remember what happened with Robert? How that ended? Now you're throwing away a good job with benefits to chase more dreams that ain't meant for us." Come home, baby. Know your place. David watched Michelle's face as the message played, saw the way she tried to maintain her professional mask, even as pain flickered in her eyes. Robert, he asked quietly. Michelle stared out the window at the construction site. My ex-fiancé. He was a teacher too, had big dreams about changing the system from within, applied for an administrative position at a private school. She paused. They loved him on paper. Then they met him. What happened? They went with a more suitable candidate. Someone who would better fit their culture. Robert. It broke something in him. Started saying my mother was right, that we were fooling ourselves thinking we could change things. He took a job selling insurance, stopped teaching altogether. David remembered entries from her diary about a lost love, but hearing the story directly from her made it more real, more painful. That's why your mother doesn't support this project? Michelle laughed without humor. She raised me cleaning houses, working herself to exhaustion. Saw firsthand how the other half lives. She thinks I'm setting myself up for disappointment, trying to bridge a gap that's not meant to be bridged. And what do you think? She turned to face him, her expression fierce. I think she's wrong. I think Robert was wrong. I think every person who ever told me to know my place was wrong. But, she hesitated. But, sometimes I wonder if they're right about you, about your motivations. Is this just an expensive way to ease your conscience? Will you walk away when it gets too hard like everyone else has? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. David thought carefully before responding. 6 months ago, I would have given you some practiced answer about community responsibility and social investment. Now, he met her gaze directly. Now I know what I don't know. Every day, I learn more about how much I need to learn. And yes, maybe this started from guilt, from wanting to do something good to feel better about myself. And now it's about Marcus getting into MIT, about Destiny seeing her first whale, about every kid who's been told to limit their dreams finally having the resources to prove everyone wrong. Michelle studied him for a long moment. You've changed. Because of you, he said quietly. The air between them shifted, charged with unspoken possibilities. Michelle broke eye contact first, gathering papers with slightly shaky hands. We should finish the budget proposal, she said. Michelle, David started. Don't. Her voice was soft but firm. Whatever this is, whatever we're feeling, it complicates things. The project is too important. Is that what you want? Or what you think you should want? Before she could answer, her phone rang again, her mother's number flashing on the screen. Michelle stared at it until it went to voicemail. You should talk to her, David suggested gently. And say what? That she's right to be worried? That she's right about how complicated this all is? Michelle's voice cracked slightly. Or should I tell her that I'm falling for someone who represents everything she warned me about? The admission hung in the air between them. David stepped closer, but Michelle held up a hand. Don't make promises you can't keep, she whispered. I've had enough of those for one lifetime. I'm not Robert, he said softly, and I'm not going anywhere. Outside, construction lights illuminated the growing framework of their school, casting long shadows across the plan spread out before them. Like the building itself, whatever was developing between them would need a solid foundation. One built on trust, understanding, and the acknowledgement of all the complicated histories they both carried. For now, they turned back to their work, letting the unspoken remain unspoken. But something had shifted. A door had opened that couldn't be closed again. The threat started as anonymous emails. Then came the vandalism, spray-painted slurs on the construction site walls. David increased security, tried to keep things running normally. But when the first brick came through his home office window with a note attached, Race Trader, the stakes became clear. You need to take this seriously, Michelle insisted, picking up shattered glass from his carpet. These people aren't just angry. They're dangerous. I've involved the police, David assured her, though they both knew how little that meant. The investigating officer had barely hidden his disinterest, suggesting it was probably just kids pulling pranks. The construction continued despite the harassment. The school was taking shape, steel beams rising, walls being erected, promises becoming reality. Then came the fire. It started small, in a storage area containing building materials. Security footage would later show someone in a hooded jacket slipping through a gap in the fence. But by the time the fire department arrived, the flames had spread to the partially completed East Wing. David got the call at 3 a.m. By the time he reached the site, Michelle was already there, watching helplessly as firefighters battled the blaze. The night air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning materials. "All that work," she whispered, her voice rough. "All those dreams." The fire chief's report was blunt. Accelerants used, clearly intentional. Insurance would cover the damage, but construction would be delayed by months. The message was clear: someone wanted this project stopped, permanently. Word spread quickly through the community. By morning, people began gathering at the site. Parents, students, local residents. They came with coffee, food, work gloves, determined faces. "We're here to help clean up," announced Mrs. Rodriguez, whose daughter ATT ended Michelle's tutoring sessions. "Just tell us where to start." More people arrived throughout the day. Construction workers from other sites showed up on their day off. Local businesses sent volunteers. Even some of David's former social circle appeared, those few who'd quietly supported the project from the beginning. Marcus, the young science enthusiast, stood staring at the damaged building. "They really don't want us to have this, do they?" "No, Davidan Serdanistli." "But we're not giving up." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Why keep fighting when they keep trying to stop us?" David looked at the gathering crowd, people from different backgrounds, different social classes, all working together to salvage what they could. He saw Michelle organizing volunteers, her voice strong despite her obvious exhaustion. "Because some things are worth fighting for," he answered. "And because sometimes the best way to fight back is to keep building." The cleanup effort continued for days. Local news covered the story, but this time the narrative was different. Images of community members working side by side, refusing to be defeated, sparked something. Donations began pouring in from unexpected sources. Other communities reached out, offering support and resources. One evening, as they surveyed the progress, Michelle found David staring at the damaged structure. "Penny for your thoughts?" "I was just thinking about walls," he said. "How some people spend their lives building them, protecting what they think is theirs. And how sometimes it takes a fire to show you who's really on your side." She nodded, understanding. "The community surprised you?" "They showed me what real strength looks like." He turned to her. "You showed me." The construction site was quieter now, the day's volunteers gone home. The damaged section stood as a reminder of how fragile progress could be, but also how resilient. Already, plans for rebuilding were underway, stronger than before. "We should install a better security system," Michelle said practically. "Already ordered, but we're also adding something else." He showed her the revised plans. A community center attached to the school. Open after hours, weekends. A place that belongs to everyone. She studied the plans, then looked at him. "They'll try again, you know. Maybe not with fire, but they'll find other ways." "Let them try," David said, his voice firm. "We'll keep building, as many times as it takes." Above them, stars were visible through the smoke-damaged beams. A reminder that even after destruction, something beautiful could remain. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more opposition. But tonight, standing in the ruins of what would rise again, they had proof that some fires could illuminate rather than destroy. The anonymous source behind the media attacks was finally revealed during a private club luncheon that David hadn't been invited to attend. Richard Sterling, his former college roommate and current real estate developer, had been overheard bragging about his successful campaign to protect property values. David recognized the irony immediately. Richard's father and his own had worked together displacing communities for development projects decades ago. Now Richard was fighting to prevent those same communities from gaining educational resources. The revelation came through Sandra Chun, one of the few board members who had quietly supported the school project. "He's planning something bigger," she warned over coffee. "The fire was just the beginning. He's worried your school will set a precedent, inspire other communities to demand similar resources." "Of course he is," David muttered. "Heaven forbid people have equal access to education." The confrontation happened at the Pacific Palisades Country Club's annual charity gala, an event David had only attended to maintain certain strategic business relationships. Richard was holding court NEA, or the bar, clearly intoxicated. "Well, if it isn't our local social justice warrior," Richard called out, loud enough to draw attention. "Tell me, David, is it the guilt or the girl that's driving this little crusade of yours?" The room quieted. David felt dozens of eyes on him, waiting to see how he'd respond. A year ago, he would have smoothed things over, made a joke, kept the peace. Now he simply turned to face his former friend. "You orchestrated the media attacks," he said calmly. "Planted the zoning violation stories. Probably arranged the vandalism too." Richard's smile turned ugly. "Prove it." "Oh wait, you can't. Just like you can't prove that school of yours will do anything except drive down property values and invite the wrong element into our neighborhood." "The wrong element?" David's voice was dangerously quiet. "You mean children who want to learn? Families who want opportunities? Or is it just anyone who doesn't look like you?" "Don't play naive, David. You know how these things work. Your father knew. My father knew. Keep the lines clear. Everyone stays in their place. Everyone's happy." "Everyone's happy?" David laughed without humor. "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That segregation and systemic inequality make everyone happy?" Richard stepped closer, dropping his voice. "You're disrupting the natural order. These people have their schools. They have their neighborhoods. Start giving them ideas above their station, and next thing you know, they'll want to live here, join our clubs, marry our children." Meanwhile, across town, Michelle was facing her own battle. She had finally agreed to meet her mother for dinner, hoping to bridge the growing divide between them. "Baby, please," Grace Johnson pleaded across the restaurant table. "I've seen this story before. White folks playing at being saviors, then disappearing when things get hard. And now I hear you're getting close to this Carter man." "Mom, it's not like that," Michelle insisted. "David's different. That's what I thought about your father," Grace shot back. "Before he decided his new white wife and her family made more sense than us." The words hit Michelle like physical blows. Her father's abandonment was rarely discussed, a wound too deep for casual mention. "David's not Dad," Michelle said quietly. "And I'm not you." "No, you're not," Grace agreed. "You're stronger than I ever was. That's why it kills me to see you setting yourself up for heartbreak. These people, they can play at understanding, but they'll never really see us." "He sees me, Mom. He's learning to see all of us." Grace reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. "Learning is not knowing. And when the learning gets too hard, when it costs too much, they always walk away." "Maybe," Michelle admitted. "But what if he doesn't? What if this time it's different? Should I let fear of what might happen stop me from doing what needs to be done?" As both conversations reached their climax, David facing down decades of institutionalized racism in the country club, Michelle confronting generational trauma at a small restaurant. The truth became clear. This wasn't just about building a school anymore. It was about dismantling walls that had stood for generations, about challenging assumptions that had shaped lives on both sides of the divide. "You'll regret this," Richard warned as David turned to leave. "When your precious project fails, when you lose everything, remember, I tried to warn you." "When the school succeeds," David corrected, "remember, you could have been part of real change." At the restaurant, Grace watched her daughter with worried eyes. "Just promise me you'll protect your heart." "I promise to be true to it," Michelle answered. "That's the best I can do." Both conversations ended in stalemate, but something had shifted. Lines had been drawn, positions clarified. The real battle wasn't just against external opposition. It was against deeply rooted fears, prejudices, and the weight of history itself. The morning of the school's inauguration dawned clear and bright. The building stood gleaming in the early sunlight, a modern structure of glass and steel, yet somehow warm and welcoming. The sign read Johnson Carter Community School, though Michelle had argued against including her name. Media crews were setting up their equipment, but these weren't the hostile reporters from before. The story had changed, a community rising from adversity, people coming together across social divides, a new model for educational equity. Even those who had opposed the project couldn't deny its impressive results. David stood in his office, adjusting his tie, when there was a knock at the door. Michelle entered, looking elegant in a professional suit, but her expression was troubled. "Your mother's here," she said. "And mine." They found both women in the school's entrance hall, standing as far apart as the space allowed. Catherine Carter, David's sister, hovered anxiously between them. Grace Johnson spoke first, her voice carrying years of pride and pain. "Before you say anything, Michelle, there's something you need to know." She opened her purse and withdrew a worn leather case. "I should have shown you this years ago." Inside was a teaching credential from 1985 and newspaper clippings about an innovative literacy program in South Central LA. "You were a teacher?" Michelle's voice cracked. "Advanced English and literature. For 12 years. Grace's eyes grew distant. "Had big dreams about changing things from within. Then budget cuts came. They let all the newer teachers go. Mostly people who looked like me. Said it was just economics, but we knew better." She touched the credential gently. "I had you to think about. Your father was gone. Cleaning houses paid more than substitute teaching. So I put these away. Told myself I was being practical." Eleanor Carter stepped forward, her usual social polish cracking slightly. "I remember you," she said quietly to Grace. "You taught at Westminster Academy. I was on the board when—" She trailed off, looking stricken. "When they decided to restructure the faculty?" Grace's smile was bitter. "Yes, I remember those meetings. All those careful words about cultural fit and traditional values." Eleanor's hands twisted her expensive purse. I never thought." "That's the problem," Grace said. "None of you thought. About us, about our dreams, about what your comfort cost us." David watched his mother absorb this, saw the moment reality cracked her carefully constructed worldview. "I want to teach here," Grace announced suddenly. "If you'll have me. These children deserve teachers who understand their journey." Michelle stared at her mother. This woman who had warned her against dreams, who had pushed her to be practical, whose own dreams had been buried but never died. "We need a literature department head," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor Carter cleared her throat. "The foundation, my foundation, we could fund a whole literacy wing. If you'd let us." David recognized what it cost his mother to make that offer. Not in money, but in admitting her part in a system that had hurt people like Grace. The first students and parents were arriving now, their excited voices filling the halls. Marcus rushed past, carrying his science project, now built with proper equipment. Destiny clutched books about marine biology, headed for the new oceanography lab. Tamara was already in the writing center, arranging her poems for the opening ceremony. "They deserve everything we can give them," David said. "All of us. Together." Grace and Eleanor looked at each other. Two women from different worlds, connected by old wounds and new possibilities. "Together," Grace agreed cautiously. As the inauguration ceremony began, David found Michelle in the crowd. "Your mother was a teacher," he said softly. "Like mother, like daughter." "She never told me," Michelle whispered. "All those times she warned me about dreaming too big. She was trying to protect you from her pain," David realized. "But now we build something new," Michelle finished. "Something that can't be taken away." The ceremony was a blur of speeches, ribbons, and applause. But the real moment came later, when the crowds had thinned. Grace Johnson stood in her old classroom, running her fingers over a pristine desk. "I never thought I'd teach again," she admitted. "Things change," Eleanor Carter said from the doorway. "If we're brave enough to let them." Outside, the setting sun painted the school in golden light. Students lingered, reluctant to leave their new sanctuary. Parents gathered in small groups, sharing hopes and plans. The barrier between worlds hadn't disappeared, but it had cracked enough to let light through. David found Michelle's diary in his office, where it had started this journey. He handed it to her silently. "Keep it," she said, "to remind us both where this began. And where we're going," he added, taking her hand. Above them, the school's motto gleamed in fresh paint. "Dreams have no boundaries." For once, it wasn't just words. It was a promise kept,